As I understand the purpose of this program, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the division and where the traits that we look at have kind of come from and where they may be going. And as you know, some of you know, I'm Jerry Allen from the University of New Haven, and I will introduce the panelists as we go along. I'm sure that you, from the program, for those people whose names were not omitted in error from the program, that you know that we have some people who really have something to say about communication traits. And so I'm supposed to say that this division actually started with a workshop in Washington, D.C. in 1984. It was organized by a lady who is no longer alive, Arden Watson, and she organized a workshop there. And as a matter of fact, I thought I had pitched it, but last week I actually found the packet of papers. She had bound them in a paper cover, a yellow one, as a matter of fact, and I found it on top of one of the bookcases in my study at home last week. I meant to bring it with me, actually, and I didn't, because it'd be kind of interesting to look at where some of our papers have, how they've evolved over the past 15 years, but I don't know, maybe we really don't want to look at that at this point in time. Anyway, at that workshop, we agreed or we thought we should have a commission. We applied to what was then SCA, the Speech Communication Association, which now, of course, has become NCA, and we applied to become a commission, and it was the Communication, Apprehension, and Avoidance Commission. And the first speaker today was the person who I think came up with that name, because I know he came up with the bylaws for the group, and he was the first chair of that commission, as I recall. I think Virginia was vice chair, Virginia Richmond. And so we had our first commission meeting in 1985. And my photographic memory's fading, so I can't remember what city that was in. But anyway, it was in Chicago, Virginia says. So that's always a good bet with the NCA. Yeah. It must have been in Chicago if you can't remember the city. But anyway, since then, of course, NCA has reorganized and has created out of the caucuses and commissions that we had back then, has created buku divisions, and now we have the Communication, Apprehension, and Competence division. Back, as I recall, and this is hard to do, but I think 3 years ago we changed the title to Communication, Apprehension, and Competence to broaden the perspective in terms of what we were studying. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim Mccroskey now, and each one of the speakers is going to take about 10 minutes, and then we'll allow you to ask some questions and make some comments. All right? Jim?
Oh, I've got to put this away first.
You're on.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. Since my program last week, we weren't able to have in the program because we evil people didn't register on time. Except I'm a life member, and I did registration. But 1 out of 4 people had not registered, and therefore the rest of us were eliminated from the program also. I'm a person who has been very loyal to NCA. My first visit to NCA wasn't NCA, but what's called now is NCA, was in 1961. I have met every other convention between that time and now. I've never missed. I will be missing next year. If they continue that policy, I don't want to be associated with this association. Now, how many people are there here? Not very many. And I know a whole lot of people who are very interested in both communication apprehension and the avoidance and other things, and many of those people aren't here because this association went to hell. And I sure hope you get this down so that it can be heard by anybody else in the association. Thank you. Now I will talk about what you told me to talk about.
I've never told you to talk about anything. but you've always done it anyway.
Well, we had a long run with the ComApp division, but of course we now have a lot more groups, and so we have less people in the groups. And people ask me, well, how are we going to do this? I can't exactly remember, but I think one of them sitting right here. What should we do about that? And it struck me right away that the other one should be they were also not getting a lot of people, but the competence area. I said those seem to be just logical, that they are in the same ballpark, if you will, in terms of interest. And that's why we decided to get these two together, because then we'll have a big group, and the association won't have to recruit people who aren't even in our field in order to keep our association going. And it has been somewhat successful. We know an awful lot more about communication apprehension than we did when we started. By the time it was, what did you say, 85? 84. We were pretty much where we are today. We've looked at and found a few more possibilities for a cure or a reduction of communication apprehension. We've also learned since that time that in many cases you are not going to help the student. We find that there's genetic elements that are involved, and that means, of course, that you have to change the gene if you're going to change the behavior. We don't do that yet. Not only the people sitting up here, the people who do all of that kind of work in other fields are still working to get some of those kind of things going. But we have to recognize when we look at something like genetics, most of us did not have a lot of courses in biology. In fact, probably there wasn't over 1% of our field that ever had any study in that area at all. So we didn't really know what was going on. But we found out that the people who do know something about it, the folks that are deal with all kinds of genetic concerns, find out what's going on in that brain. They couldn't do that until late 1900s. 1990, I think it was, when they were first able to find out what was going on in a live brain. Prior to that time, you could only study dead brains. And, of course, you didn't have a lot of volunteers say, kill me. And so that was, they studied the stuff that was available. But in the 90s, they were getting more and more information. Psychology jumped in. One of the things that they noted was about temperament seemed to be very genetically controlled. And they said specifically in some of their research that communication was the base of this. And essentially they're saying, how do you know somebody is communicating if you don't what? You have to have the communication information. And the kind of stuff we were working on, they were working on some else, but they said that the core of all of this is communication. And so we got accepted, essentially, in our field by psychology by recognizing that human communication is core to human behavior. And that made a big change, because we are having people now that are learning that kind of stuff that are in our field. And when we talk about the future, I think we're going to see somewhere down the line a solution to communication apprehension. Maybe it won't be 100%, but if we can get it so that another 10% we can get to be cured, we'd be extremely satisfied. But in our research up till now, the average probably is about 7% benefits. That's not good. That's not good. It means most of our high apprehensives are not going to get any real help. Maybe we can get that with the genetic part, but to expect that we can cure them all or anything like that is going to be a very, very distant future. Many of us will probably not be around for that, but maybe there will be people who can find more data that's broader than where we are now in terms of trying to understand the treatment issues. And I know certain people are doing different kinds of things, trying to get better information, better treatment options, and I think that will happen. It's a matter of how long it's going to take. And I think I've talked long enough, haven't I?
You never talk long.
I think I've got my 10 minutes in.
Keep in mind, folks, that when some of us were doing our graduate work in the 70s and even the 60s, that we never talked about communication apprehension. We never studied it. Jim and Gerald Phillips with the Reticence work were beginning to do some work in the 70s, but until we actually started this commission in the division in the 80s, look at how many articles there are in our journals now about communication apprehension. And you know, your universities, I'm sure, have courses and parts of courses that are devoted completely to communication apprehension, and of course now in a broader context, not only competence but also trait in terms of communication traits. Our next speaker is someone who has lived through all of that and has contributed a number of those articles that we see in those journals now. The most published woman in the field of communication, Virginia Richmond.
Thank you, Jerry. My name is actually Virginia Peck Richmond, and I say that because I am a proud member of NCA and have been for a number of years. Without CAA, Communication Apprehension and Avoidance, and now Communication Apprehension, Avoidance, and Competence, I probably would not have a career. Other than the fact that I was a lucky person and had chosen a graduate school in which to work, which was called West Virginia University Department of Communication Studies. Actually, at that time, it was speech communication. And they had listed in their yearbook, they had interesting things to study for someone starting to school at an early age. And they didn't have the same old speech kinds of things, but I came out of the same old speech kinds of things, so I enjoyed that side too. And but they had something called CA, and they had some other things such as nonverbal communication, and things that were really interesting to a person from the state of West Virginia. And in the state of West Virginia, even today, children and adults do not get the best education that they should have. So if you don't seek education outside of that state or in the better programs within that state, you will be undereducated for most of your life. But when I started working with communication apprehension, it was with Mccroskey and Daly. And it's a shame that John Daly did not appear today because he is a very big part of CAA and communication competence. In fact, he's one of the most competent communicators you will find in the field. We're all quite quirky, but we're pretty good at what we do. I have found that communication apprehension and avoidance and looking at competence combined has actually had a much larger impact on the field than some may think. And it reminds me of that when I look at students or future teachers sitting in the audience, when I look at current faculty sitting in the audience, and when I look at the prestigious panel on which I'm a member of. And the fact is that most of us, because of apprehension and an understanding of apprehension, avoidance, and competence, have become better educators in the field of human communication. I can remember my early days in being taught, here is what communication apprehension is, here is what it is not. And of course, through the years, we've distinguished CA and CA avoidance from willingness to communicate in other kinds of areas such as shyness and self-perceived communication competence, most of which those measures have Dr. Mccroskey's name on them, and many of us were just very fortunate to be able to work with him. But it made all of us better educators and better teachers in the classroom environment. That's what I've done most of my life, is I have been working to be a better teacher most of my life. The research is what gives us the information and perhaps some of the motivation to apply to the classroom. But having knowledge about certain things that can disturb student learning, student affective learning, and student behavioral learning, and of course cognitive, is the kind of thing that makes us better teachers and educators. I knew Elaine Kelly years ago. She was one of the first women who was studying communication apprehension and avoidance and competence. She came from a different model than I did, but we have been together all these years working with this wonderful variable. And it has made us better educators and teachers. I have watched these other people teach and give programs and share information, and they are good. They are very good at what they do. They're among the top 5% in our field. And it's because many of us stayed with one or two variables for much of our careers. Now, I expanded out early into homophily. And the interesting part about homophily and opinion leadership at that time is I was at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I proposed a dissertation using homophily, credibility, and opinion leadership. Well, like most students, I guess I hadn't learned to be humble enough. So my committee rejected my first proposal. I was absolutely devastated. And I literally went back home, spent a few days very distressed. I had a very good advisor, John Patel, and I also had a good committee member, Bill Seiler. And both of them said to me, here's what you have to do. Use the area in which you really enjoy the most. And I said, but University of Nebraska-Lincoln is not that fond of communication apprehension and avoidance. They said, we don't care. Go with that for your next proposal. Well, 6 months later, I came back with a proposal on communication apprehension, avoidance, and whatever we knew about competence, and proposed that as a dissertation. The committee accepted it. I was completely surprised. I thought, well, here comes my second humiliation. I just didn't realize that as you grow, you're humiliated probably several times each year. You just learn to deal with it better than you did when you were younger. So I had my dissertation, and it was a dissertation about trait versus state. And we found out that trait carries so much of the variance, but there are certain states, such as novelty, the state of general anxiety, and other areas that will cause a person to spike, so to speak. I tend to be more on the continuum in terms of being apprehensive, but at the same time, I know the different states, and I understand my own trait, that I can work better with it now. And I teach it regularly to my students in public speaking classes, public presentation classes, organizational classes, interpersonal, and even in nonverbal classes. This is an important concept that will never leave my teaching side unless someone says you cannot teach this. And then we'd have some problems, because I would say this is one of the most research validated areas in our field. Why are we not teaching this? Everywhere I've ever worked, I have helped with the public speaking courses, and I thoroughly enjoy the public speaking courses, but you still have to put in that touch of affect and that special ingredient called I am a teacher who understands communication, apprehension, avoidance, and competence, and how do we help those students who are in our classes to succeed in those classes. It's not a cure. No way is it a cure, but you can make a student feel better. You can allow them to learn. You can allow them to learn to participate in small ways in the classroom. And you have a very good opportunity to recruit that student into your program as a permanent student. And I think most of us in this room, our goals are to learn, our goals are to teach, and our goals are to recruit good people into this field. By understanding communication, apprehension, avoidance, and how this links into competence makes all of us better teachers. Thank you.
Our next speaker comes out of the Penn State Reticence program, which I mentioned earlier. She's now at the University of Hartford, of course, and that's Elaine Kelly.
Since Jim Keaton and I prepared our chapters for the Avoiding Communication book together, sure. We also prepared our remarks together today, and so we're going to do something a little bit unusual. I have 3 points to make, but I'm going to make 2 of those points, and then Jim's going to talk, and then I'll make my final point. And the reason for that is then we're going kind of chronologically from the past to the present to the future, and it made more sense that way. So just so I don't throw anybody off when I start talking again after he is finished. The reticence construct is an alternative construct to communication apprehension. And if I can, I'd like to leave one key point with you, and that is that the reticence construct has an essential role in the history of this whole area, and I hope will have an essential role in its future. 3 things, and 2 now and then 1 later. With the reticence construct, Gerald M. Phillips actually got the whole ball rolling, so to speak, when in 1965 he published his first article on the topic of reticence. Prior to that, people in the field were focused on public speaking anxiety or stage fright exclusively, and it was Jerry Phillips who said, wait a minute, people experience a lot of difficulty communicating in other situations as well. Even Jim Mccroskey, I hope you don't mind me quoting you, in 1997 said that the work of Clevenger and Phillips provided the foundation on which I have built my conceptualizations of willingness to communicate, communication apprehension, and self-perceived communication competence. So Phillips really got the ball rolling, and I think that's important that that be in the record because we are focused here on the whole history of how this thing developed. Second point I'll make is that the reticence construct has always been linked with treatment or with helping people. And any changes that have occurred in that construct over time were because of that focus on treatment. For example, Jerry Phillips first defined reticence as an anxiety-based personality disorder. And so at the time, 2 methods of treatment were systematic desensitization and sensitivity training. And based on some studies, I think by graduate students at Penn State, those treatments didn't work for reticence. They didn't work because they were indirect treatments. They treated anxiety, but they didn't improve performance. And Jerry Phillips was very interested in the performance element, in getting people to be more competent communicators. And so in the mid-'70s then, he reconceptualized reticence to be a problem of inadequate communication skills primarily. He said that the major characteristic of reticence is avoidance of social situations in which they feel inept. He said it doesn't even matter whether they're inept or not, but if they feel they're inept and they avoid situations, they are reticent. He did also include what we would call a cognitive component to reticence. He said reticence believed in a set of myths or faulty beliefs about communication, and that contributed to their avoidance of communication. So for Phillips then, reticence was a behavioral problem that could be addressed by speech communication professionals through a program that he called rhetorotherapy. I'll make a plug for a panel that we're on tomorrow that focuses on interventions, and we'll talk about it there. Now, Jim Keaton and I were both graduate students at Penn State, me first and then him, although I like to think of him as older. And so we had the opportunity to study with Jerry, and then we did our own research on the topic. And throughout over a decade of research on reticence, we made some slight modifications to the construct in which, for example, we included an affective component of fear of negative evaluation because our research bore that out. Jerry Phillips had said in his work that reticence is an emotional experience, that it does involve anxiety, but that was all irrelevant, right? Because he said, I don't have any evidence that anxiety impedes performance or that alleviating anxiety makes people better performers. So he acknowledged it but kind of dismissed it, whereas Jim and I consider it to be essential. That is, this fear of negative evaluation is an important component of the reticence construct. So just to sum up that final point before I turn it over to Jim, reticence has always been focused on treating it, and so modifications of the construct have been made as the treatment has been developed, and the focus has been on helping students overcome their reticence and become better communicators.
Thank you, Lynn. I'd like to share with you 3 of the recent developments, primarily in the last 10 years, taking a look at the reticent constructs in 3 areas. One is taking a look at treatment components, another is computer-mediated communication, and finally, the etiology of reticence, looking at social explanations. In terms of the treatment components, for those of you that are not familiar, the Penn State Reticence Program pretty much is an entire semester long. It's quite a demanding process, and a lot of instructors don't have the luxury or the resources to implement this kind of a program. And so we started to ask the question, are any of the components of this program something that we could test and therefore offer to instructors of public speaking? And let me share 3 with you that we found really are helpful in the process. The first one is the notion of gradual exposure to public speaking. One of the things that we do in the Penn State Reticence Program is get people together in a circle and ask them to give a 1-point, non-graded talk. And they get together in a circle and they go around and they talk about this, and then we tell them, congratulations, you've just given your first public speech. And there's usually disbelief on their face because public speech is up in front of a crowd, standing up, giving extended points. It doesn't feel nearly as informal to just say to them, you've already done part of what you need to do. So the whole notion of a gradual exposure, not really taking them all the way up at first, giving them a little bit of confidence to move forward. So we're finding that gradual exposure does help individuals, especially those folks that are highly reticent. Also, goal analysis has been very helpful. Goal analysis is the process where a person really says, this is what I expect to to get out of this experience. And for the reticent individual, it's particularly important because often their goal is unrealistic. It's, I want to be perfect, or I want the audience to love me when I'm finished, or I want a standing ovation when I'm done, because they have this expectation that somehow if they're not perfect, it didn't go right. And so the notion of pinning them down to a goal of giving a speech for 3 to 5 minutes with 3 points or whatever else, and a preparation process to go with that, and a process for evaluating that helps them to keep it contextualized and grounded. Otherwise, they can get caught off into this fantasy world of the standing ovation, which we all are expecting at the end of this panel. Right. Okay, I've planted the seed.
By the multitudes present.
Yeah, and for those watching at home. The third is the practice with the instructor, and I know many of you might cringe at that prospect to actually have individuals come in to your office prior to giving a public speech and giving you that speech, so essentially you have to do twice as much work. But what we found is that provides a safe environment for these individuals. It gives them feedback without being graded, which lessens some of those anxieties as well. It also prevents procrastination, as Joe Ayers and his colleagues found, that often the folks that are really high in apprehension act like they don't have to give a speech and hope it goes away until the day, and then they somehow expect eloquence to come streaming out. So this actually forces them to go through a process where they prepare and then come to the office. And it also assures the student, you've met the assignment, you're fine, let's go in front of the rest of your peers, and you'll do okay. So we offer those as 3 very solid, concrete ways that individuals can lessen some of those intense responses. In terms of computer-mediated communication, we've been taking a look at this now for a number of years, probably 6 or 7 years, because honestly, we've noticed that reticent individuals and individuals with high CA are drawn to computer-mediated communication, drawn to email. And as soon as I say that, many people go, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about. And so the question became why. And so we looked in a number of areas. We started off with faculty-student interaction because honestly, that's the easiest place to start. And we found that reticent individuals really do prefer email when communicating with the professors more than talking on the phone or face-to-face communication as well. And also that reticent individuals prefer the asynchronous channels of communication, meaning they like the channel that affords them the luxury of time. Because if you're talking on the phone or other kinds of mediated channels, whether it's text messaging, but I don't know, a lot of you, do you text message with your students? No, I don't either. Good. I'm glad to hear that that's not an expectation these days, so grad students don't get any ideas, please. But the notion is having the luxury of being able to think about it, to prepare for it, and even engage in feed forward is something that may draw them toward that. Then we also looked at things like the motives for people using computer-mediated communication and found that really reticence did not differ in the forms of CMC that they used, but that reticent individuals' communication with their friends via CMC has increased, but their face-to-face hasn't decreased. So what we are suggesting is that it's actually augmenting their communication rather than CMC replacing their face-to-face communication. Finally, we've been taking a look at the notion of affect for communication channels. What is it about the way people feel about email that might actually make a difference? And we went through a 2 or 3 year process where we asked over 200 students, what do you like about computer-mediated communication, what don't you? And then we had some graduate students at a program that I'm very fond of go through about over 200 people's responses over thousands of codes, got that together into a questionnaire form, did the whole factor analysis. You know this better than any of us, right? Pruned it down to 21, and we found really 3 dimensions that emerged, and that is the increased preparation and control associated with email that really draws people toward that mediated form. We also found the flip side, that folks think that sometimes email and other mediated forms don't have enough emotion or meaning to it, so people develop negative affect toward computer-mediated communication. And then also people report reduction of anxiety and inhibition in that. And so we're starting to get a notion that somehow the mediated form levels the playing field in many ways because it allows people to prepare a little bit more, it allows them to be a little bit more blunt, and they don't feel all the pressure of face-to-face communication. So that's an area we've been exploring as well. Finally, we looked at the notion of the etiology of the reticence construct, and we were looking at the social communicative explanations. We were not taking a look at the biological or genetic explanations. And we were curious, for example, do folks that report chronic reticence, is there anything different about their family of origin and the communication patterns in the family of origin? And what we found is that reticent individuals report coming from families where they don't talk as much about their thoughts, about their daily plans, about their hopes for the future. And in addition, they are not nearly as encouraged to talk about their own emotion, to talk about what's going on internally, which sent off a trigger, because for those of you that have studied emotional intelligence, this starts to sound an awful lot like that concept. So we did a follow-up piece, and we found that reticent individuals really have less emotional intelligence, because if you think about it, if you're raised in a family where you have a lot of turbulent emotions, but you're not really given the opportunity to talk about it, to label those emotions, to engage in problem-solving techniques with those emotions and somehow cope with those, eventually all that turbulence is something that just is left to wreak havoc on you. And so what we found is individuals that are given the skills of emotional intelligence are almost inoculated, because then they can label their own emotions. They can find ways to effectively cope with those emotions, even though they are acute feelings. And in doing so, live more productive lives in that sense. So 3 areas that we've been following up on: the etiology, as well as computer-mediated communication, and the components. Now I'll turn it back to Lynn to finish off.
The future of reticence. Drum roll, please. I believe that the future of reticence is bright. I think that there's likely to be renewed and expanded interest in the construct because of its emphasis on treatment, treatment that can be implemented by communication professionals. With communication apprehension now being reconceptualized as having this strong genetic component and not really treatable except through maybe pharmaceuticals, right? People like us don't have the license or the knowledge or anything to implement any kind of drug therapy. We are people who can train people in communication skills. And so the reticence construct might continue to be appealing to people in our field whose primary focus is on treatment issues and how to help their students become more competent, more confident communicators, because the reticence construct is a conceptualization and a treatment methodology built right in the rhetorotherapy notion. So we believe and hope that the future of the reticence construct is bright. Jim and I are not at PhD programs, so we don't have PhD students that we're training ourselves in this construct, but we do believe that communication professors and up-and-coming communication professors could do a lot with the construct in terms of helping future generations of students. Thanks.
A look at the physiology of communication apprehension is brought to the table by Chris Sawyer from Texas Christian University.
Thanks, Jerry. My choices for graduate school, because that seems to be the theme of how we're all starting our remarks, is back when I was a graduate student, these things happened to me. And some of them were by design, but some of them were just good fortune to be able to pick a program that had certain individuals whose research agendas were full and whose energies were great and fascinated graduate students. And when they went into the field, they took up the mantle and they went and they did all this work. And it is always a pleasure to hear these remarks from such as these that have spoken previously, because it's a little bit like when you participate in this, that you're taking a seminar and you hear things that you go, wow, I didn't realize that, or I didn't realize that when I read that thing, and that was the background of that piece or something like that. So it's always a joy. My choices of going to graduate school, I was actually in a theological program and got interested in communication. That's another long story. And my mentor from my undergraduate days said, "How far away are you from TCU?" Because I was living in Fort Worth. And I said, "I can see it from my back door." And he said, "Well, why don't you go to school there?" And I said, "I don't have the money to go to TCU." And then I was introduced to the concept of graduate student aid and what a tuition waiver meant and so forth. And I ended up going to school at TCU, and I met Ralph Binke and in my master's degree work. Ralph is just recently retired, but still is one of the forerunners of psychophysiological research in our field. And it was a great fortuitous thing to meet him and to learn about this sort of subdiscipline a little bit. If you're not familiar with psychophysiological approaches, that's okay. There are not many studies of psychophysiology in our journals for a very, very good reason. It's really hard work, and it's not easily, those data points are not easily come by. But when I was preparing for this today, I had a moment to read an article by a gentleman named Albert Axe. And Dr. Axe was founder of the Society for Psychophysiology, and in the lead article in the journal Psychophysiology, when I say lead article, I mean the lead article. I mean the first article in the first, edition or issue of the journal. He describes the goals and the methods of psychophysiology. And he begins to describe something called the Translator Mechanism. And what that is a way of describing how the physical reactions of an individual interact with the psychology of an individual. And that's the translator mechanism. And he goes and he lays out this really nice analog, and he says, well, it's a little bit like operating a computer. He says, now I'm not saying human beings and their nervous systems are computers, or we should carry this from an analog to an allegory, but basically, he says, when everything operates nominally well, at the surface, there is no need to understand how the machine actually works and what's going on beneath as it processes data and gives you output and so forth. When it goes wrong, when there's something wrong with your machine, so to speak, and when it crashes or what have you, that's when you begin to wonder how it really works. And he says the translator mechanism is this thing that operates between the operator level, or functions between the operator level and how the machine really works. For a great many people, communication apprehension is a minor inconvenience that is easily overcome because they don't have much of it, or they have only a moderate amount of it, or a normal amount of it. And so we have certain expectations in the classroom geared to those kinds of individuals. So that's one thing. So when it operates that way, it's a minor thing. But once you reach once you have coming into your classroom an individual with high communication apprehension, suddenly it becomes important. When you try to tell colleagues on campus, that's a good idea, having those reports and those speeches in your political science class. What are you going to do about people who melt down or freeze up? And they say, oh, that'll never happen in the first week. Someone melts down or freezes up. Then they come to you and say, what do you do about that? And you say, well, you can't do much about it when it's happening. You have to do something before to get them prepared so it doesn't happen when it is small and yet far off. That's when you take care of the problem. Psychophysiology deals with, in this way, it is an approach and a subdiscipline that looks at what this is and how it goes on, and then it may give us some indication of what we can do about it, but it takes place through that level, through that kind of understanding. Some many years ago, scholars in our field assumed that stage fright, and that was the operative term of the day, that stage fright was just really one thing that could be represented with different kinds of measures. That is to say, you could measure stage fright with self-reports, or you could measure stage fright with behavioral observations, or you could measure stage fright with some kind of measure of their physiological reactions like heart rate or so forth. And so studies emerged in which these various types of variables were used and employed, but when you tried to correlate them, they didn't work out very well. One of Ralph's mentors was a gentleman named Ted Clevenger. So my lineage is Clevenger through Binky, and Ted Clevenger, who wrote this great synthesis of research in stage fright in 1959, says that when you take a look at these three types of response systems, they just don't correlate very well. And he wasn't really able to advance a reason why, because no one knew the reason why they didn't correlate very, very well. And so much of our work and our research has been, comes from the fact that we pick our own poison. So it is much easier to gather self-report data and develop scales like the PRCA and do some other things. And so we go there. That's the low-hanging fruit. Psychophysiology, much more difficult to do, although very useful to understand why people get upset, or they freak out, or they freeze, or they melt down. And so there have been some movements in the field, and I want to highlight just a few of those and tell you where we're kind of going or where it's sort of going in the next few. One is a movement from this idea that everything is just all one thing to it is a multiplicity of things that can be studied. That includes an orientation of communication apprehension is both trait and state, okay, which we've already highlighted a bit here. So that a generalization, if you ask people to generalize about how anxious they get, that's a trait orientation. If you're looking at things at a particular moment as they unfold, that's a state orientation. And that's the area where Ralph and I have done most of our work. And although we love traits and we love to see how traits produce states as they interact in situations, we're primarily interested in states. And that's where psychophysiology comes in. One of the things that we have done over in our work is we've taken a strategy we call unrolling the ball of string. That is to say, what we look at is not speech anxiety in one moment, but speech anxiety over multiple moments within a same situation. So we have found patterns of state anxiety which exist in both psychological measures and physiological measures. And we call these generally, these overarching patterns, sensitization and habituation. We find that habituation is a very, very good thing. It happens with most of our students. And sensitization happens in averages about 20% or so of our students. Sounds familiar to me. Recently, we have, Amber Finn and I and Ralph have conducted a study in which we tried to figure out how the PRCA public scale, I hadn't told you this yet, Jim, but we found some work, have done some work in which we have discovered that a particular level on the PRCA public subscale predicts very, very much that whether or not you're going to be a sensitizer or an habituator. And so there's a cutoff point. I'll tell you more about that. Yeah. So it's really, really exciting to us because everyone uses the PRCA as a screening tool, and if we can adopt that understanding, then we have a way of now diagnosing who might sensitize versus who might habituate. So that's a good thing. Another movement is from cardiology to neurology. Our earliest studies were all about heart rate. Many of our current studies still about heart rate, but we've become more and more interested in the functioning of the nervous system and of the brain. And so what regions of the brain interact producing the state anxiety response. So that is also the thing we look at. Last, let me talk briefly about some predictions for the next 5 years or so, and then I'm concluded my remarks. But one is that there should be more psychophysiological research, and there will be simply because the technologies are becoming much more cost efficient and efficiencies in terms of time. Now, just to tell you a little bit, and we've got some graduate students here, so you may not actually know what this is like, but when you conduct a psychophysiological study of, say, heart rate during public speaking, what you have to do is this. You have to have a room where someone partially disrobes, and you have someone attach electrodes to their body, okay, in various places. And you have a little thing called a transmitter that you hook to their belt, and you plug that in, and they re-robe themselves, and they go in and they give the presentation, okay? There's a big machine, okay? There's a great big machine called a physiograph, which looks a lot like a polygraph machine. It's got a roll of paper that unrolls at a certain rate of speed. It's got pins, and they mark on a piece of paper as it goes through. And then if you know what you're doing, you can count and measure the heart rate. But what it takes is taking those rolls of paper and getting a well-trained graduate student, because no professor wants to do this by himself, but you take a graduate student and teach them how to do this, and they measure the heart rate. And then you, at various intervals, and then what you do is you find the peaks of those heart rates, and you make a measure called mean cyclic maxima. Your eyes already glazing over? This is what you have to do, by hand. Okay. And after all that, so if you wonder why there are only like 30 subjects in one of these studies, that's why there is, because it just takes forever. And, you know, in the middle of the speech, if one of the leads falls off, bad situation. Today, this can be done with technology that simply attaches next to someone's skin the actual fabric out of which these devices are made out of, conducts the electrical impulses, so you don't have to wire somebody up. You don't have to have a nurse in there putting it on for them. And you can gather the data directly into, or capture it directly into a data processing kind of situation with a laptop, and immediately can make all the calculations that you want. So there should be more psychophysiological studies, particularly of heart rate, but of other types too. Another thing that's sort of interesting is that we have now come to believe that the nervous system of animals and humans is hierarchical in nature, which we can now, this is an idea which we can exploit. The Blanchards from New Zealand have a program of study in which they have discovered various reactions occur to a subject depending on the level of the stimulus intensity involved. In other words, the more intense the kind of stimulus is, the more threatening it is, or more stress-producing it is, different kinds of reactions can occur. Okay? This is not something that we have really fully explored in our research, but is something that psychophysiology can really do, and that is we can manipulate stimulus intensities of various types, like the size of an audience or how difficult the speaking assignment is and what have you. And by doing so, we might be able to find how the various types of anxiety responses actually fit this translator mechanism. So if we can do that, then perhaps we can learn or begin to formulate a sort of a general field theory of how these things operate together, with the view always of helping people become better and overcoming their fears.
Another of the authors of Avoiding Communication on the panel is Karen Dwyer.
Hello, from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I got into this field as a part of my master's degree. I was a GTA, and I didn't really have anybody mentoring me in communication apprehension, but I had students that were fainting, that had to leave the room to get sick, and I thought, how can I help these students? And so I have to echo what's been said here, is that these people that are involved in research in communication anxieties and competence have heart. And I think everyone that I have met through this division over the years loves teaching, loves students, and really has the goal to help them. So I knew right away when I got involved in this division that I found my place. And so as I started attending in the early 90s, and by that time I was just beginning my doctoral program, I had the first Avoiding Communication book, was like my little Bible. Now we're all authors in this book, our chapter authors. And the first one, I believe, was 1984.
Yes.
And then there was another one in 97. Mm-hmm. And then this one is the one that pulls everything together. I do believe if you're interested in communication apprehension and competence research, techniques, differences of opinion, that you will really like this book. It's great. And so it was like my little Bible, because my mentors are right here, and I had their book, and I read everything. And, of course, I ended up doing a dissertation on communication anxiety, created a program for it at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where I now work as basic course director. Actually, I'm assistant director of our School of Communication. But I wrote a little book that tried to bring all the techniques together in what was called Conquer Your Speech Anxiety, and it's still available from Wadsworth. But here's where I add my little dime's worth, which isn't much compared to these people that I have admired for years, and that is this. And I'm going to quote these people too, these great researchers and authors, is that I noticed that they kept saying, and here's a quote from Kelly, When the nature of the problem, speaking about communication anxieties, is assumed to stem from inadequate communication skills, an intensive skills program is advocated. Second, when the problem is viewed as anxiety-based, relaxation therapy is proposed. Finally, cognitive therapy is advocated for those whose problem is presumed to stem from inappropriate cognition about self and communication. But she said, present methods of identifying the problem are unable to provide the information needed to make a decision with which mode of treatment would be most appropriate for a student. And I kept seeing for 20 years, starting back even the 70s and 80s, people kept saying, well, we know these techniques do help reduce anxiety, especially for public speaking students, but we don't know which one works. And a lot of times, an instructor just chooses the method that they have the most time for. And I thought, and that's a quote from Kelly and Keaton as well as others. And so I thought, well, now, with this anxiety program I started back in the early 90s when oral communication became a gen ed requirement at the University of Nebraska, where all 15,000 of our students have to take a public speaking class, I started seeing that people were dropping out. And I started reading the research back in the 80s that said 50% of the students that have communication apprehension by the time they're in their sophomore year, if they don't get help, they'll drop out of college. And I thought, there must be a way to really help these students and bring these techniques together. Well, in my doctoral program, I happened to be taking a course from a student of Arnold Lazarus, and he was a professor, but his professor had been Arnold Lazarus, who wrote the brief therapy, the multimodal way. He wrote multimodal practice. And I began to understand that his approach was different than cognitive psychologists. Whenever there's a phobia, which I believe we work with a lot of people in public speaking classes that have developed a phobia, or where there's any sort of anxiety or human problem, he said that it's not necessarily, you can't just address it cognitively. Really? Okay. He said that there are 7 dimensions involved in our personality, and because we're so 7-dimensional, we have so many dimensions involved, that we have to look at all the dimensions and begin to provide treatment to those dimensions. And out of that, he developed what's called multimodal therapy, and he has what was called then the basic ID. And that when you are giving therapy to anybody with anxiety or phobia, that you consider these 7 dimensions and you begin to access where they are. And he said one of those dimensions is a culprit. One of those dimensions is the initiating point. And you can offer people treatment in all these different areas, but unless you find the initiating point of an anxiety, they will have trouble overcoming it. They can't be helped because you have to get to the source, right? I mean, that made sense to me. You know, you can give people medicine, but if you don't know what the real source is and apply treatment at a source, you can't be successful to ever getting them over it. So out of that, I developed what was called the multidimensional model. And the multidimensional model is based upon multimodal counseling theory. And it has, I use the acronym BASICS. B stands for behaviors, A stands for affect, S stands for sensations, I stands for imagery, C stands for cognitions, and the final S of BASICS stands for stress, which is a way of trying to pull together 2 dimensions, interpersonal relationships, and drugs' biological functions. Bottom line is this, that you begin to teach students to assess their 7 dimensions. And you say, okay, or 6 dimensions, I've narrowed it down to. You say, well, but that's counseling theory. But I found out there were published articles where different educational classes, programs like first-year experience classes, programs in education, where they begin using multimodal therapy evaluation because it's really a model for evaluating and treating in education classes to help students see where maybe their problems were coming from and then choose their own techniques. So I got interested in then using this BASICS to help students analyze the source of their communication anxiety. And I think bottom line is we have students assess their BASICS. We have them track their firing order, and my students, any one of my classes, would be able to tell you, my speech anxiety classes, well, the top of my firing order is sensations, which is a nervous physiological response. The top of my firing order, the first thing that happens when I have to give a speech is cognitions. I think, oh, this is terrible, I can't do it, people will negatively evaluate me. Or there's some students that say, I see myself, the minute I hear the word speech, I see myself looking like a fool. They're able to really image this. And so then using the multidimensional model, students then target, find out what their source is, and then apply their own technique. And so in an article in ComEd in 2000, as well as in this book, then I took all the techniques that we know and matched it with the basics. And then I did do research on this, and I can continue to do research on it. I have so much data, but ultimately I find the same thing, which was published in 2000, and that is students really do the best when they find out, they begin to understand it, where the initiating problem is happening in their personality dimension, and then choose a technique for that. So I guess one of the things I found, too, is I wanted to address the fact of Jim saying, and not just Jim only, of saying, oh, no, it's all genetics, no one can be helped. And the rest of us saying, well, there's skills training. I even brought diaphragmatic breathing with one of my graduate students, and we found diaphragmatic breathing was successful. So the issue is here, I think when you're dealing with high trait communication apprehension, you have a huge genetic component. And when you're dealing with state anxiety or maybe even a phobia about public speaking, a learned response, that students really can be helped. And I think we're trying to maybe find the difference and walk through that fine line as to, I would never tell a student, and I know some of the students in my special sections, are neurotic introverts. They probably can't be helped. But I'm not going to tell them, oh, no, you can't help you. Because I take the, humanistic approach that anybody can be helped. We can help you. We can lower it, even if it's a little bit. I can help you get through this class. And so what do I think the future is going to hold? I think there are techniques that do help students reduce anxiety. I think whether it's, neurological, physiological response, cognitive, competence issues, they can be helped. And I think that we need to clearly distinguish, again, even though we've known there's state and trait, but we need to even further distinguish between the two because people can be helped. I also think that we do need to look at instruments because we used to say above 80 trait communication apprehension. One of the things I've noticed on the PRCA, is you could have low anxiety in interpersonal relationships and have high anxiety in discussions, meetings, and public communication, and then you end up with a high score in the PRCA and you're labeled trait, when indeed I'm not so sure they're completely trait as much as they've developed a phobia along the way about speaking. It's kind of like a bonded response, and they can be helped. So I'm looking for new instruments that maybe can be more specialized, and I'm looking for a word that comes out that differentiates for the casual reader that those with trait CA can't be helped, you're out of luck. But an article which we tried to make the point in this book that people can be helped. They can be helped. They may not, neurotic introverts may not become extroverts, but everybody can be helped, and we would never want anybody to give up.
Okay. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, if you have any for the panel. Mark?
Can you be familiar with using virtual reality as a
Yes.
Yes.
What do you think?
You're talking about using virtual reality as a way of immersing students, and so you get an exposure. Yeah, that's an up-and-coming thing because you can manipulate the environment that is the stressor, the stimulus, and there is some promising work in that. Here, it's coming. And those technologies are becoming more cost efficient and available, and people are using them more and more. So.
I think that's definitely the future. I know we've had research reports on using those before at our meetings, and I think that as the cost comes down, I agree, it's going to really help.
Any other questions?
There's one over here, Jerry.
Dr. Dwyer, as far as documenting, having the student come in and document which area that they may suffer this phobia,
Right.
Would a personal interview be the best way, or would self-reporting on a computer be the best? How do you get that person to open up to determine?
Yes. Well, actually, I do have a little handout that you can use, and I did bring handouts for people, just a one-page summary of what's in the chapter, but in a little book, Conquer Your Speech Anxiety, you have what's called the, it's a PDA, it's just a personal dimensions little survey where they imagine themselves giving a speech or try to feel the idea that they're giving a speech and then begin to track the firing order, rate which of these dimensions are responding. And actually, they just understand, I teach it, even just reading a chapter about how the dimensional sourcing works. And then there's just this little, I'll show you, it's just actually using the basics, 6 little questions. They just begin to analyze and try to figure out what's popping up first. And it's interesting, and this is what I say in both the book and in the little Conquer Your Speech Anxiety book, is that, so it's not perfect. So they think that, they feel all those sensations and think that that is really the thing that is causing us the sensations, when instead there's just a cognition going on first that triggers sensations. That's okay. Start with where they think it is and then move on to another technique, because the thing about multidimensional model is that as things pop up, then you understand what's happening a little bit more. Because I'll tell you, one of the things we know about people that have a nervous system sensitivity is that they know what's going on. And so just explaining it to them, they quickly figure out what's happening. And so as they move along, they're saying, well, I really was getting so nervous, and I started thinking, I just thought, I'm going to get a poor grade. And so then they realize they're dealing with a cognition. They begin to apply coping statements. So thanks for asking. I love to talk about that.
Another question? Jim?
Yeah, I would just address it to whoever. In our university, University of Central Florida, we for a long time had a huge speech program which was required of everyone, and with budget and politics and so forth and so on, we still require a communication course, but it can be one that doesn't involve public speaking, where you talk about communication with 300 of your closest friends. You don't actually stand up in front. And the question is, have any of you had success at having students come for help in large numbers with their communication apprehension if they weren't conscripted to take the course? In other words, if the course is there and that's what they fear, they have to walk through the jungle with the snakes, then they're interested in learning how to deal with their snake phobia. But if they can just conceivably stay out of the jungle, can you reach them?
Yes, we can reach them. And several years ago, Dr. Mccroskey and I conducted one of the systematic desensitization studies that's reported in World Communication Research. And we simply asked the students who felt they wanted to be involved in this, and did you have these feelings, very much similar to what other people do on the panel. And it takes a lot of time to do SD and then walk people through the SD sessions. And we did that for a beginning of term and finished 8 weeks into the term, and then we kept track of how people did in their classes. Most of these people, if you can approach them either through Mediated or in a one-on-one, or you do a survey in the class, such as Karen does, they will come and they will seek it out, and we do have ways of helping.
I think we have to recognize that there are a number of ways of helping. And when we got the first one, then we wanted a second one, and all of that, and said, if this one will do 5% and this will do 5%, that's 10%. Now we get reality has to be noted. We have all these methods, but if you do all of them, put them together, what you get is whatever the highest one is.
The highest one in some of our studies came out as systematic desensitization, then cognitive restructuring, and then skills training, in that order.
And the thing is, whatever method you use, you're going to get probably pretty close to the same amount of positive result. But that is variance accounted for, probably not more than 10%.
And definitely as instructors in many of these classes, we help these people.
Yeah, I think we've got to be very careful when we tell them we can help them.
Yes.
Because in those cases, we aren't going to help them. I think that this is like, when somebody's trying to sell a car. Should be able to tell them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And that is, yes, maybe we can help you by 10%, but 90% of the people don't react to this.
Jim,
now, those numbers, are just what we're suggesting.
Don't you think it's motivation too, though?
No.
No. Okay. I think
that students, if they are scared to death, they're motivated primarily for one thing: getting the hell out of here. And that's evidenced by the number of students that do get the heck out of here. The first time we did a study, it was at Michigan State University, and it was public speaking was required of all students. You can imagine how many that was. They would show up on the first class. We'd have 80 students in the class. They'd find out they had to give a speech. 30 or 40 of them weren't there the next week. They know what's going on. And if somebody tries to tell them, that, we will make everything well for you, it's not true, and they see through it.
We do the option at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, where Dr. Hickson and I work together. We have the interpersonal class and we have the public speaking. But over the last 3 years, we have managed to keep every public speaking class full, and much of it has been because we've been teaching the instructors and the adjuncts about CA, CAA, and communication competence. Dr. Hickson's class naturally enrolls 150 every semester, but the public speaking is keeping right at 30 per section, and we have close to, this year we had 495 students, all of whom stayed in the course. Hopefully they'll graduate from that course.
Mm-hmm.
At Penn State, just to finish up on your question there, I think, and then I saw another hand shoot up. At Penn State, they had a required speech program, and they probably still do, or a course for everybody in the university. And there were people who were going to drop out of the university rather than take that course, and that's what prompted Jerry Phillips to start the whole, quote, Penn State Reticence program or rhetorical therapy program. I think one of the important questions that's being raised here when we talk about can we help people or not is how do you define help?
Mm-hmm.
On what dimension are you referring to? Mm-hmm. And I think Jim is largely talking about their anxiety level and so on. And the rhetorical therapy approach takes the stance that we don't know if we can do anything about their anxiety level, and in some ways we don't care. The question is, can we get them to stand up and be able to give a speech or raise their hand in a class and ask a question or start a conversation with a stranger, in the cafeteria? If they can do those things, even if they're still a nervous wreck, well, we've helped them, right? So I do think that's an important question, is what do we mean by helping people?
Yeah, I think that's very correct. It's a matter of does it stick? I mean, it really helped you if you had, I was 99% scared to death. Now I'm 98. I'm really happy. And it doesn't work that way. And what we have to do is find out and make sure each method that is used does have the proper conclusion, what we want, or if it doesn't, then we should be still looking for more approaches in order to get at it. And there are a lot of different ways. Every one of you folks have done something different. All right, what's the variance accounted for? Right, and when you take one of those together and put it with the next, what happens to the variance accounted for? And what we've seen historically is whichever one you use, it seems to be somewhat helpful for some of the students. But then the rest, it doesn't. So on average, we've suggested, I believe it was about 8%, 9% with a couple of them. And that's just not enough to say, you know, I've made a big impact on these students' lives. It didn't. Right,
Let me jump in just for a second. I would agree. I think what we might also be saying here is that what we're hoping to do to help our students is help them to develop skills that they might be able to use so they can construct a public speech or interact socially or whatever else. If we set the criteria of actually changing their physiological reaction to a novel stimulus, I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think we're talking about whether or not they can be taught a set of skills that are of some value to them as they progress through whatever career they have. So most importantly, when we say I think we can help, is if they have to give a speech. Yes, they might be terrified yet again, but outside of our class, when they have to give a speech, are they more or less competent? Have we helped them with their behavior? Do they know how to organize main points? Do they have an attention getter, etc.? So even though they might not feel different, they still may freeze or melt, did you say, Chris? Melt or freeze, or whatever you like. It sounds like we're talking about ice cream. But either way, we could make a difference in that sense. And so maybe as they get more experience, they habituate a little bit more in front of a crowd. Lynn and I are always talking that the first time we ever did this, we were scared to death. But we've been doing this long enough now that either something's wrong with us or we're not scared to death anymore. So maybe since we had the skills, we habituated over time, we're now very comfortable in front of an audience. So I think we can help, but I don't think we can change people physiologically. I think you're right.
I think that you're correct, Jim.
What variance accounted for there? What percentage of your students got that way? What percentage stayed that way? How much better are they?
That's right.
And without that variance accounted for, we don't know whether we did anything or we didn't. Several times we obviously didn't.
Obviously, there's very little communication apprehension up here. I do feel compelled, however, given the recent exchange, to mention one person who's responsible for a body of research that's not on this panel today, and that's Joe Ayer's visualization work. So just for those of you who might be interested in pursuing this topic in terms of reviewing the literature on it. But nonetheless, we are over time. And so thanks to our very competent, loquacious panel, and let's give them a big round of applause.